dawn creeps over the Roman skyline. The streets are quiet, but behind the high walls of a gladiator school, a ludus, the day has already begun. The clang of wooden swords echoes through the yard. Sweat hits the sand before sunlight does. Inside these walls are men trained to kill for applause. Some were prisoners, others slaves. A few chose this life willingly, not just for survival, but for glory. We often imagine gladiators in their final moments, bloodied, roaring, fighting to the death in front of thousands. But that image is incomplete. The arena was the climax, a few minutes that could decide everything. But the rest of the time? It was repetition, discipline, suffering, waiting. So what did Roman gladiators really do all day? To understand them, we need to step beyond the sand and into the world that made them. A world of harsh training, strict diets, brutal routines, and surprising fame. Because these men weren't just fighters. They were celebrities, investments, icons, and every day of their lives was designed to prepare them for one moment in the arena. The moment everyone remembers. But what about the rest of it? Let's find out. When we think of gladiators, our minds go straight to the arena. The clash of steel, the sand-stained red, the roar of 1,000 voices demanding blood. But long before they stepped into the amphitheater, these men lived entirely different lives. Who were they really? Gladiators were not simply savage warriors. They were part of a complex system within the Roman Empire, a blend of military discipline, theatrical performance, and political propaganda. The word gladiator itself comes from gladius, the Roman short sword. But their weapons varied just as much as their backgrounds. Many gladiators were slaves, taken from conquered territories across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Others were criminals, condemned to fight in place of execution. But not all were forced into the arena. A surprising number were volunteers, men who willingly gave up their freedom and signed contracts to become auctorati. They might be desperate, in debt, or simply drawn to the fame and potential fortune. These fighters lived in ludi gladiatori, gladiator schools that operated somewhere between a military camp and a prison. The most famous was the Ludus Magnus, located right beside the Colosseum in Rome. It was directly connected to the arena by underground passageways. Other schools operated in cities like Capua, Pompeii, and Ravenna, all overseen by a lanista, the manager who owned and trained the gladiators. The lanista was not just a coach, he was a businessman. Gladiators were seen as investments. They were bought, trained, promoted, and even rented out for specific games. A popular skilled gladiator could earn huge betting money, draw crowds, and bring fame to his ludus. Some were even sponsored by wealthy citizens or politicians, their careers rising and falling like athletes today. Gladiators weren't trained at random. They were categorized into classes, each with specific weapons, armor, and fighting styles. These categories weren't just for show, they were designed to create drama and balance in the arena. A Thraex, armed with a curved blade and small shield, might face off against a Murmillo, who wore a large helmet and carried a heavy rectangular shield. The Retiarius, with his net and trident, was meant to dance around heavier opponents like the Secutor, built for relentless forward pressure. Each class had its own tactics, strengths, and vulnerabilities, and gladiators trained obsessively within their category. The system wasn't chaos, it was a violent chess match, played in blood. And understanding that structure is the first step to understanding what their daily lives actually looked like. A gladiator's life was dominated by routine, not just because of discipline, but because the margins between life and death were razor thin. Every day was a rehearsal for survival. The day began early, usually before sunrise. Gladiators were woken by the sound of commands from their trainers, known as doctores. The morning started with light physical training, stretching, shadow fighting, and long runs around the training yard. This wasn't just to build stamina, it was to condition reflexes, footwork, and mental discipline. Even the simplest motion, stepping backward without tripping, holding a guard without tiring, could be the difference between cheers and death. After the warm-up came weapons drills. New recruits used the rudis, a wooden sword, to learn the basics. They'd practice striking poles called pallus, repeating the same movements over and over until they became automatic. Veterans drilled with real weapons, their sessions tailored to their fighting class. Net and trident for retiari, sword and shield for Myrmilos, daggers for Dimicheri. Instructors were strict. Mistakes meant extra repetitions or beatings. Even laughter or casual chatter during practice could lead to punishment. Gladiators lived in close quarters and trained together daily, but camaraderie was always balanced by the knowledge that one day they might face each other in combat. Midday was for food and rest. Contrary to modern assumptions, gladiators didn't eat like elite athletes today. They consumed a high-carbohydrate diet, heavy in barley, beans, lentils, and sometimes dried fruit or vegetables. Roman writers even referred to them as hordeari, barley men. This diet wasn't just for energy. It helped build a protective fat layer over their muscles, a kind of natural armor to shield internal organs during a fight. After eating, there was usually a short rest, then back to training. The afternoon sessions focused more on sparring and situational drills, learning how to face off against different classes, how to use terrain and timing. Sometimes, these sessions were done in full armor, adding exhaustion and realism. Injuries were common. Broken fingers, pulled muscles, bruised ribs. Gladiators were valuable, so on-site medics treated wounds, applied herbal salves, set bones, and helped fighters return to training quickly. They were patched up, not pampered. Evenings were quieter. Some fighters wrote graffiti, played dice, or quietly repaired gear. Others simply slept, too drained to do anything else. And in the silence, they knew tomorrow would be the same. Until the day came when it wasn't. To understand a gladiator's life, you have to understand the business they were a part of. Because for all their training, discipline, and suffering, gladiators weren't soldiers. They were entertainers. And the Roman Empire was obsessed with spectacle. Gladiator fights weren't private affairs. They were staged events called munera, often held in massive amphitheaters like the Colosseum. These events were usually free to the public, sponsored by politicians, emperors, or wealthy elites trying to gain favor or distract the population from political unrest. Bread and circuses, food and entertainment were the tools of control. Each munus was carefully planned. Matchups weren't random. Gladiators were assigned opponents based on class, style, and spectacle value. A Thraex, armed with a curved sword and a small square shield, might be matched against a Hoplomachus, who fought with a spear and heavy armor, a clash of mobility versus reach. Some duels were designed to feel like chess, tactical, technical. Others were pure brutality, pitting two Myrmilos, both heavily armored and wielding large shields, in a slugfest that tested endurance as much as skill. Because of this, gladiators developed reputations, and with them, followings. Fans carved their names into walls. They cheered their favorites, wore their likenesses as oil lamps or figurines, and even placed bets. Some gladiators received gifts and letters from admirers, including Roman women from upper classes who saw them as dangerous and desirable, a combination that fascinated Roman society. Promoters knew how to sell drama. Gladiators were advertised with painted posters around town, listing their win records, fighting class, and the date of their next appearance. These posters, or libelli, served the same function as modern sports marketing. They built hype, rivalry, and expectation. Between major matches, gladiators might participate in mock battles, known as luciones. These were rehearsals or low-risk fights used to test new fighters, entertain smaller crowds, or sharpen timing and performance. Even these events were public. Part of the gladiator's job wasn't just to fight well, but to look good doing it. They were taught to exaggerate their movements, to draw out fights, to make combat theatrical. Death was always a risk, but a swift, boring fight was worse for business than a drawn-out, spectacular one. And so, even training emphasized not just killing, but killing with style. The arena was a stage, and every day outside it was practice for the grand performance. It's easy to look at gladiators and see nothing but violence, blood in the sand, steel against bone. But behind that spectacle was a life of structure, discipline, and endurance. Gladiators were not mindless killers. They were products of an empire that transformed violence into performance. Their days were filled with calculated preparation, not chaos, and their survival depended on more than brute strength. They needed timing, control, strategy. In many ways, they were the elite athletes of their time. And yet, they lived as prisoners. Even those who volunteered had to sign contracts surrendering autonomy. They were told when to sleep, what to eat, how to fight, and who to face. Injuries didn't mean rest. They meant treatment and a quick return to training. There was no escape from the routine, no days off, no guarantees of tomorrow. A mistake in training could mean punishment. A mistake in the arena could mean death. Still, within this rigid world, gladiators formed identities. Some became legends. Fighters like Spiculus gained the favor of emperors. Others earned their freedom, granted the rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing release. These men were sometimes celebrated even more in retirement, becoming trainers, bodyguards, or public figures. But most didn't make it that far. For every famous name, there were hundreds who died anonymously, bruised, broken, forgotten. And yet the system endured, not just because it entertained, but because it told the Roman public a story, that violence could be controlled, that order could be imposed on chaos, that even death could be made into a ritual. In that sense, the gladiator wasn't just a fighter, he was a symbol, a human being shaped into an idea the empire wanted its citizens to believe in: strength, sacrifice, discipline, and dominance. It's also worth noting what they didn't do. They didn't march into war. They didn't earn political power. They didn't own land. They didn't raise families, at least not within the ludus. Everything they did, from training to sleeping to eating, was part of a system designed to feed the games. So when we ask, what did Roman gladiators do all day? The real answer is, they prepared. Every moment was in service of something bigger than themselves. A performance, a machine, a myth. And that makes their story more than one of violence. It makes it a story of control, of endurance, and of what people become when society turns life and death into entertainment.